One of the constants during my 6.5 years in the federal parliament has been the complaints from individuals and from small business owners about the behaviour of the banks, and also the fact that when they have a grievance with their bank, there's no effective process to have that grievance dealt with. So my experience is there's a need for reform, big reform when it comes to the banks, and that reform must be driven by the federal parliament. Look, before I go on, I want to make it perfectly clear that I'm not here to bash the banks. Indeed, I'm the first to acknowledge that banks are really important institutions and that the banking sector is vitally important to the Australian economy. Now, my issue today is about consumers and whether or not they're getting a fair go in this environment. And it is hard to get a fair go when you're dealing with business on this scale. Let's look at the figures. Last year, the big four banks alone made about $30,000 million profit. In fact, the profit of Australian banks is about 2.9% of the country's gross domestic product. That's an enormous amount of money. Almost 3% of our GDP is attributed just to the profits of the Australian banking sector. That compares with about 1% for US banks and about 1% of UK banks in those countries. This is big business, and it's hard for consumers to get a fair go when you're dealing with business on that scale. The banks, of course, argue that they treat consumers well and that, in fact, consumers are protected by the Code of Banking Practice. But that code simply doesn't work. And it's not surprising when you consider that the code was written by the banks, is implemented by the banks, and the cost of that implementation is paid for by the banks. Let's look at the figures. In a recent year, there were about 8,000 breaches of the code effectively reported to the banks, and only 21 of 8,000 were deemed to be significant. Now, the banks might say that consumers can also go to the Financial Ombudsman Service, but that also is written, set up, implemented by the banks, and the figures are no better. In a recent year, there were something like 34,000 disputes reported to the Financial Ombudsman Service, and only 5 of them were deemed significant enough to be reported to the Australian Securities and Investment Commission. That leaves only APRA, the Australian Prudential Regulation Authority, as the only government-run, government-funded, independent regulator when it comes to the banks. But you know what? APRA does not look at complaints from individuals. So, to cut a very long story short, there is no protection for consumers other than the protection, the so-called protection, that's offered by the banks themselves. In other words, the fox is in charge of the henhouse. Frankly, this situation is a nonsense, and it's way beyond time for the Australian Parliament and for the Australian Government to do something about it. Now, recently, I was really proud to second a private member's bill by the member for Kennedy that would establish a commission of inquiry into the banks. I was also really proud to table a private member's bill in my own name that would establish a mandatory code of conduct. That would turn the current voluntary code into a legal instrument and would give the government and the relevant minister oversight of that code. It would also give the Australian Prudential Regulation Authority the ability to name and shame banks and to even fine the banks when they're guilty of misconduct and mistreating consumers. Unfortunately, though, the government refuses to implement these sorts of reforms, continues to refuse to have a commission of inquiry or to have a mandatory code of conduct. So it looks like we're going to have to keep up the fight. Well, I'll keep doing what I can in the Parliament, but there's a lot of responsibility now on the community to keep up the pressure on the government, to ring up talkback radio, to write letters to the paper, to meet with local members and senators, and to say to those people, we need reform and we need it now. We need reforms that will level up the playing field, give consumers real rights, that will protect consumers, And I tell you what, it will also put the banks on a sustainable footing, a footing where they have the confidence of the community and they can do well into the future. That would be in everyone's best interest.